because people failed to accept and explore the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
So here's this problem. I have this idea of an ethno-state. It's for whites only. Whites only. Oh, and if you're not white, but you're in favor of generally what, say, the Republican Party claims to support and closed borders, you're also allowed in. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of the Republican Party in practice, but if you generally support the platform of the Republican Party, that's good. That's a good practical line to draw and say that even if you're not white, you're still allowed into the magical, mystical ethno-state somewhere over the rainbow. And if you're white, but you're a shitlib, well, then you're prohibited. How this is to be practically enforced is another issue, and there are ways to figure out people's true political beliefs even if they lie, using autonomic responses to stuff. But before we talk about how we're going to do this, let's figure out what it is we want to do. And that is the white ethno-state. But if you don't believe the right things, you're not allowed. And if you believe the right things, you are allowed, even if you're not white. Which is to say, strictly speaking, it never was an ethno-state and I'm retarded. A person who had a sizable channel and argued in favor of the alt-right before it was fucked up beyond all recognition, something I'll talk about later in this video, told me he wasn't white and asked me if he would, just as a hypothetical, be granted access to King Ryan's ethno-state. And my knee-jerk response was, of course, that if I had my way, any non-white who supported us would be our brothers in struggle. That the issue right now is that white people are the only group who can be legally discriminated against and are culturally vilified, and the deepest lie is in the history. The lies that involve first off outright blatant falsehoods about slavery, but also the lie of decontextualizing slavery, the lie that it was ever established that blacks suffered from it, compared to the alternatives, and I go into great length on that elsewhere. This Sarah Jeong shit has also been illuminating. It's what we've been saying this whole time. The New York Times is a racist outfit, among many others. They usually hide it better than this. And I was so worried that the New York Times would fire this bigot, because if they just fired her, that would dampen the claims that anti-white race hate is real at the New York Times. We would still be able to say, yeah, they fired her because she was caught this time, but it wouldn't have the same impact as if they did not fire her. So they kept her, and the New York Times showed themselves. When someone attacks me as being bellicose, as the aggressor, this is completely inverted. What exists in the United States is starting at age 5, little kids are taught that white people are bad. At an age when 83% of kids believe in Santa, they're shown pictures and told how mean white people were to black people at age 5. There's no context. Their brains can't understand that slavery is analogous to a kind of universal military conscription, except it's for labor, not war. They don't understand that white people were far more humane than anyone else at this, that white people ultimately ended slavery worldwide through their empires that basically covered the whole planet. They're never taught that black slaves, upon emancipation, had higher literacy rates and higher rates of employment in non-agricultural labor and the professions than people from, say, Russia or China or India did, and that they had a higher life expectancy to boot. They probably had more freedom of movement as well as slaves, but that's a little bit harder to quantify. People don't know that there were slaves who were bankers, slaves who were accountants, slaves who were leather workers and tailors. I mean, look at this. I'm watching Roots here, and credit to them, they do show that it was other blacks who actually enslaved blacks in Africa, so give them credit there. But here, you have them just walking in a line and a guy's just whipping them. He's like, yeah, I'm a mean guy and I'm just gonna whip you because I'm a mean old white man and you're black and I can do this. It's retarded. And look, I'm not going to go all over that here. You can read the relevant articles or watch the videos on slavery, segregation, and of course race and IQ if you want those arguments fleshed out and sourced. We're not posting comments about that. I'm going to be really totalitarian about comments where you argue the facts on those things, because this video is about something else. The purpose of the race and IQ stuff is to counter an accusation that white people have unfair advantages somehow. It's not bellicose. It's not an aggression that comes out of nowhere. It is something that emerged in response to these attacks, which have now come to be known as white privilege. Because they're saying they're entitled to some form of restitution because of racial disparities, and what do they use as evidence? This and this. And having taken some time off away from the constant dealing with people, it's come to me as a revelation what I'm motivated by is not the idea of a white ethno-state, but about the lies that so many believe. And that's what we need to deal with, these lies. lies about history, and lies about the cause of racial inequality. And on the idea of some sort of white space carved out of the US, I've come to the conclusion that it's really not feasible. I used to think there was a chance for it simply because I viewed pan-European racial identity as an inherent latent force, but now I don't. And on top of that, I don't even see it as being the most desirable thing. Obviously, carving a white ethnostate out of the US would be better than not doing so. But that just means that a white ethnostate minus the transition cost is more valuable than the United States as it exists today. That it would be better than America, but that's a pretty low bar. So there's no white nation. The whole of European history attests to the lack of an overarching racial solidarity. Perhaps that's because whites are such a strong majority that when whites are threatened by a non-white force, they will unify. Well, the United States seems to be a case study of that not happening. Yes, whites are getting more conservative, but given what we know about the genetic component to political beliefs and the fact that white conservatives outbreed basically everyone, possibly including native-born Hispanics, though at that it's close, we would expect that whites over time are getting more quote-unquote conservative. We would expect whites to become more conservative each generation. Now, it's true that when presented with evidence of whites becoming a minority, whites in the moment become more conservative. But out in the field, you have to deal with the fact that that information doesn't get out there perfectly, and that counter-narratives are spun against that, saying that this is good or that it doesn't really matter, and all sorts of stuff to try to mitigate the effect of this information. Even when facing minority status within a measurable period of time, a solid 37% of whites voted for Hillary over Trump. And in terms of political struggle, the functional battle lines are Democrat Party versus Republican Party. You all know I'm no fan of the Republican Party, but it's like a rugby scum that never ends. And there's only two directions that the ball can go, and you can push the pile in one of the two directions in this true dichotomy. Sean last did some work breaking down white voting by ethnic group, and there are entire ethnic groups that identify with the Democrat Party 2-1 over the Republican Party. People from Poland, Hungary, Russia. Absolutely shameful given how level-headed these people tend to be back in their home countries. He also compiled median incomes of various ethnic groups in the United States. And some of the gaps between white ethnic groups within the US are as large as those between whites and blacks or whites and Hispanics. According to last quote, these differences aren't random either. Fulford et al. Analyzed data on the ancestry composition and GDP per capita of 1,154 U.S. counties, tracking census data for all the years between 1850 to 2010 to create a much more accurate measure of European ancestry that is normally available. Controlling for the effects of race and the effect of immigrants choosing to move to economically well-off counties, Fulford et al. Found immigrants who came from richer nations had a more positive effect on GDP, and in the long run, it was found that a 1% increase in the GDP per capita of an immigrant's nation of origin predicted a 0.3% increase in their effect on county GDP per capita. The paper further shows that the impact that immigrants from a given nation will have on the economy can be predicted by how long that nation has had an independent state and the degree to which it has a culture characterized by trust and cooperation. Once these variables are controlled for, the formal education of an immigrant group does not predict its impact on the economy. So, differences between European ethnicities were real back then, and they are real now. At the same time, it is important to realize that the popular story of certain groups, the Irish and Italians, for example, slowly rising up the American economic ladder over multiple generations, is largely false. In the time of mass European migration, it was common for migrants to move to America, try it out, and if things didn't go well, they would return home. Between 1850 and 1913, roughly 1 in 3 American immigrants returned to their nation of origin. Between 1890 and 1920, 54% of Italian immigrants returned to Italy. The poorer an immigrant was, the more likely they were to return home. Just as an aside, a similar phenomenon occurred with immigrants from the South moving into the northern United States, where living standards tended to be higher in the North. However, the workload was also much higher than it was in the South. And many people who were simply unwilling to work 12, 14-hour days left the North and moved back to the South, where the norms were shorter work days and shorter work years. Sean continues. Abramitsky et al. Showed that if you look at long-staying immigrants, even in the early 20th century, most European immigrant groups, including the Irish, Italians, and Russians, had above-average incomes, and this was true within the first generation of immigrants. In fact, for most European ethnicities, there was very little difference in income between the first and second generations. It's easy to make a group richer if you get all the poor people to leave. That is largely what America did. The story of a multi-generational climb to the middle class is largely untrue. And in terms of European ethnic groups voting, Sean found that the percentage Protestant negatively predicted the ratio of Democrat to Republicans, i.e. Protestants are more Republican. People from more economically free countries were more likely to support the Republican Party, and whites with higher IQ tend to support the Republican Party more than whites with lower IQ. And this is a finding that a lot of people will argue about, but we've shown elsewhere that this is true. That the myth of low Republican IQ comes from a lot of states in the South having a lot of blacks, but also having a Republican electorate. For example, Mississippi is a Republican state despite being around 40% black. One thing that what the alt-right used to be mostly got right was that cucking doesn't pay. And this is mostly true. Pandering to Hispanics is a bad idea. Pandering to blacks is, pig-brained retarded. And pandering to Asians is risky. In general, there's nothing to gain from a Republican by going soft on immigration. You won't win over any Hispanics or Asians, especially since most of them actually hold views on immigration similar to that of Trump. One issue with brown people is that for any given ideology, fewer of them vote Republican than whites do. For example, you can see the stepwise party changes in whites when their ideology changes, using the question, should the government reduce income differences? Now, among blacks, there's very little change. With Hispanics, there's some change, but they're still majority Democrat voters, even when they say government should not reduce income disparities. Asians, however, if comprehensively convinced, will eventually vote Republican. So among Asians, there is hope, and it is possible. And in the past, Asians did vote Republican. And on top of this, changes in the Asian demographics only explain about 18% of the change in Asian voting. So most of this change of Asian voting came from something else, possibly the rise of Christian evangelical influence in the Republican Party. But when you're thinking along a separatist line, the majority isn't necessarily what you're most interested in. So let's take this region of the US and say for immigration policy, they have to be documented Republicans. Now, one problem is that people will just lie to get in, but again, there are ways to deal with that, such as autonomic responses to stimuli, which have an over 90% correspondence rate in assessing ideology, plus stress tests, a stress test on political questions. You ask questions about what they think about immigration or wealth redistribution, in addition to your records on their party ID, and possibly even digging up records of actual voting, which in theory shouldn't exist, but I have a suspicion that we actually know how people actually voted, and if we can actually find those records, that would solve this problem very fast. Of course, in theory, the government doesn't keep records of people's votes, but I think they do. So you can use a combination of things to screen out potential liars that are trying to get into your country. Party registration, autonomic responses to stimuli, a polygraph, specific neighborhood they came from, and the odds of them being Republican or Democrat based on the neighborhoods they came from, their race and ethnicity, their facial structure, which reveals testosterone levels and various hormone levels, which is predictive of political views. And so with these combinations of heuristic, I think you can screen out around 95% of the liars who are shit libs, but who say they're Republicans in order to try to get in. Not that we would even necessarily have the problem of shit libs trying to get in. I think most of them wouldn't want to come anyway. Now, one thing that was always a big stickler for me on what I'm talking about here, which is the filter state, was regression to the mean. Sure, you can bring in some Republican voting, conservative Asians and Hispanics, but what will their children be like? Well, the heritability of political position on a basket of issues is about 0.4. it's higher on some issues than others. For example, your views on immigration tend to be more heritable than economic views, which makes sense as different views on immigration probably reflect a different underlying evolutionary strategy, whereas economic views are highly contextual in a primitive hunter-gatherer or proto-agricultural society. Now, the heritability of party ID is about 0.3 based on the twin studies. However, one thing I want to say is that the parent-offspring correlation in party ID is much higher than 0.3. The heritability is what we get from twin studies, but the parent-offspring correlation is much higher than 0.3. It's something like 0.8. It's really high. The heritability of party ID is something where what we call shared environment or home environment has a profound impact. But forget that. Forget the shared environment effect of party ID. Let's just go with the heritability. Use the breeder's equation to estimate what the party ID of each racial group's children is going to be. So 3 would be average, 0 would be total Democrat, and 6 would be total Republican. And this is ignoring the fact that massive shared environmental effects would still continue to occur. We're just going to assume a 0.3 correlation. And if you assume a 0.3 correlation, what we see is that Asians and Hispanic children from Republican parents will probably stay Republican. Of course, the white retention is higher than Asians or Hispanics, but Asians and Hispanics at levels 5 and 6 do remain Republican into the next generation. And of course, regression to the mean only happens once because regression to the mean is basically regression to the additive genetic effects. And the additive genetic effects don't go away after the second generation. Right? Those are there to stay, and so it doesn't regress any further. But remember, if we're talking about creating a new society, be it a totally separate country or just a block of states that have wrestled from federal government the ability to control their own immigration policy on, say, I don't know, the grounds that the Constitution no longer applies in matters of immigration as the federal government has abrogated their duty on immigration, that would be one thing you could talk about. And so the states have begun to act to control their own borders. That's something I'll perhaps talk about at a later time, how I think it could be done, for whatever you think my insight on that is even worth. But in this new society, regression most certainly wouldn't be even this far. The correlation wouldn't be 0.3, it would probably be something like 0.8 or even 0.9. Because these are the expected regressions from Asians who live in California more than any other state, for example. When we have a society where anti-white racism, anti-civilizational attitudes, and the promotion of mental illness just aren't taken seriously and get you shunned in this new society, I don't think these numbers will go down this far. I don't think the regression will be as far in a healthier society. However, with the blacks, we can expect regression to go past the midpoint, i.e. even those who rate themselves 6 out of 6 on the scales, blacks would be predicted to regress to majority Democrat in the second generation. But I think that even blacks, if they were in a healthier society, they would only regress to maybe a 4, because the shared environmental effects on the blacks would still exist. They wouldn't go away. So this little table here, this is sort of a maximum regression we would expect. I will say that white nationalism makes more sense if it's just blacks and whites, because those differences today are close to typological when looked at in terms of not just any one trait, but overall psychological profile. And when you look at it intergenerationally and you get those regression effects, when looked at that way, there's basically no overlap between any two African or European families intergenerationally. But for other races, it makes more practical sense to treat them more individualistically. And there's a difference between not cucking and turning your back on potential allies. Now, in practice, the kinds of videos I'm going to be making on this channel aren't going to change very much at all. Race and IQ is still overwhelmingly important. Anti-white racism is the biggest danger to first world civilization, and white identity is not a destructive force anymore. And obviously I go further and say, and never was. And I think if you can get people away from knee-jerk propaganda-induced reactions, I think most people don't actually have a problem with some people wanting to make a white-only space. They certainly have no problem with a Chinatown or a Japanese-only space. It's just the propagandization and emotional fear of some mostly mythical white supremacist menace of the past. And once you get past that, there's no inherent opposition to some white people wanting to go out and make a white space. For me, I go back to the European Revolution. What happened was a first world mentality came to predominate in a certain region of the world. This was a result of the upper classes having above replacement reproduction and the lower classes having below replacement reproduction, and thus the upper third completely replaced the bottom 2/3 of the population in Western Europe. And this happened twice, i.e., there was a genetic replacement of the bottom 2/3 by the top third, and then it happened again. On top of this, 1% of the male population was executed each generation for criminal acts, and over the 700 years that this happened, that's about 28 generations. Now, the real effect on violence, taking out the top 1% every generation for 28 generations, is going to be much more of an effect than if you, say, removed the top 28% in a single generation. And you can think of this sort of like a tumbler, where each cycle you take out the top 1% dirtiest clothes, and then you do it again, and then you take out the top 1% dirtiest clothes. You're going to take out more dirtiness than if you took out the top 28% dirtiest clothes in one cycle. Go watch the European Revolution, where I explain that more fully, that the effect is going to be more than just taking out the top 28% most criminal today. Yeah. And it was this type of person who ended feudalism and created the middle class, workers who also had stock in companies. It was when you had these rich people become without money, they didn't become poor people, but they became rich people without money in Western Europe, that they invented ways for working class people to invest. And it resulted in coming up with a way to buy not an entire company or an entire voyage to India, for example, but shares in companies and voyages. The average worker couldn't afford a voyage, but he could afford one share of stock in an expedition. And it was the increase in the number of people who think like rich white people that led to the Industrial Revolution. And so maybe you could call what I am thinks like rich white people nationalism. You could call it that. But I like the term first worldism. And of course, what exactly defines the genetics of a person who crosses some threshold of being classed as first world or not, that is a bit fuzzy at this point. And it would be nice to, in the future, more properly define this. But at this point, it doesn't really matter. Having a precise definition doesn't really matter, because we're in the United States, and what's the functional battle line in the United States? Well, the functional battle line is Republican Democrat Party. It's that dichotomy, with the Republican Party being the flawed avatar of the first world mentality. And that's what matters, not our precious Irish blood. And this has been really rough. Okay, this has been really rough for me, because I love the idea of my people. No, the idea of my people. My ancestry being Irish, Scottish, Ulster Scot, and Norwegian. But it's just an idea, because when you pitch to the Irish that they need to preserve themselves as a people from a genetic standpoint and keep Ireland not just white, but Irish white, they treat you like you're some sort of demon for having the gall to so much as wish for their continued existence. It's a very natural thing to care about your people, but at some point, you just get tired of being a chump. Why should I care for a people that don't care for themselves? Why should I care for a people who don't value ancestry enough to consider me one of them, and considers an African who speaks with an Irish idiom to be one of them instead? So you have an African in Dublin who considers himself more African than he does Irish, and then the people of Ireland consider him to be more Irish than me. So fuck these people. Forget it. They're lost. They've completely lost the plot, and they're going to lose their country as well. There's no point in having all this solidarity with these people who think I'm just scum of the earth for saying, hey, perhaps you should continue to exist. My thought was that there was some latent pan-European nationalism in just about all white people, just below the surface, and it just had to be brought out, but I just don't think that's true. Now, in normie world, there's lots of people like Mr. Medicare and Andy Worski, people who are like sort of conservative, whatever. But when we go onto the internet, all of these people now, they have had access to pan-European racial ideas. So here on the internet, we actually have that experiment where we have these sort of conservative, you can call broadly quote-unquote right-wing in the common vernacular. Their political views are in that direction. And we go onto the internet, and they aren't hostile to pan-European racial identity. In fact, they seem to wish people like Jared Taylor and me well. People like, the Ralph Retort are even friendly to Richard Spencer, who I am not. Ralph Retort is more friendly to Richard Spencer than I am. So his zone of tolerance for what I guess today are extreme right-wing views seems to be even larger than mine, even though I would consider myself to have been more, quote-unquote, to the right of the Ralph Retort, to use the vernacular, although I may not be now anymore. And according to my idea of how this works, people like the Ralph Retort, Worski, and Mr. Medicor, they shouldn't exist. Basically, once the emotional resistance to white nationalism is overcome, my thought was that they should then be white nationalists, but they aren't. My view was that the only thing preventing this latent white nationalism in around 80 to 90% of white people was emotional resistance. Remove the emotional resistance, and they're going to, to use a line from Richard Spencer, become who they are. But in the case of Ralph Retort, Worski, and Mr. Medicor, the resistance has been removed, and they do not become white nationalists. They're a refutation of this. And they have big followers of people who aren't emotionally opposed to white nationalism either, and yet they don't support it themselves. So it appears that white nationalism is not inevitable once the resistance to it is overcome. And this is a sample size of 3 plus whatever it is you think their fan bases constitute. And that's a little bit muddy or whatever, but this is not, there has been no renaissance of white nationalism once the emotional resistance is removed. And that was the whole point of pushing pan-European white nationalism as an angle, that this is natural, this is all that can win, and that it was deviation from white nationalist principles of the founders that got us in this mess. That was my argument. But it's no mistake that white nationalism is a uniquely American idea, since the writers of the Constitution were very clearly white nationalists, as I outlined in my video conceived in white nationalism. That's undeniable. But white nationalism now is neither optimal nor politically plausible. An ideological filter state would create a better society and is more politically plausible. So that's really the end of the main video, and you can turn it off now, because at this point I'm basically just going to talk about what a colossal piece of shit Richard Spencer is. This isn't directly related to the main purpose of making this video, but I don't know when I'm going to be able to make this kind of video. I've wanted to talk about this for quite a while, for no particular ideological reason, just because Richard Spencer is just such a piece of shit, and I feel the need to let the world know. So where to begin? Well, I guess I'll begin by preempting the charge that I'm ducking a live confrontation with Richard here. I've attempted twice to argue with Richard about his strategy, just his strategy, not even getting into any core beliefs, but just talking about his strategy on JF's channel, and Richard refused to do this twice. So don't say I'm being evasive. I'm absolutely not. If anyone's being evasive on this, it was Richard. But consider that Richard Spencer has no problem talking to Dinesh D'Souza or talking to any other of the institutional media in general. See, he has reporters lodged squarely up his ass when he's doing live events, and he'll talk to the SPLC and the kinds of people who want you dead if you're white, unless of course you're an Uncle Tom white, in which case they only want you feminized and castrated. So he'll talk to these people who will slander and smear him all day in a totally predictable manner, but suddenly has the strategic foresight to not talk to me. And this is so amazing, because go back to the alt-right retard rallies. You know, those events where they would march out with their faces in front of the cameras, getting doxxed and smeared and look like idiots standing in front of a larger counter-protest, all those things that drove the alt-right into the fucking ground, right? Where they would have a bunch of like swastika morons running around with them. I told them not to do the retard rallies. I was one of the voices saying, don't do this. Nothing good can come from this. You don't control how your rally is going to be presented. You don't control who's going to show up. They're just going to slice up your clips and they're going to smear you. And anyone who's not dumb as pig shit knows immediately, without any experience, to not have a retard rally. It is intuitive. It is a thing you just know. You don't need to learn. You don't need to learn to not do retard rallies. You just know to not do them. To not march or even have a little campus speaking event, because you don't control how it's going to be presented to the audience you want to reach. Unless the event is only going to be covered by your own media, in which case just make your own media. Like, there's literally no reason to have a retard rally. Now, I think Richard Spencer knew this, but I think he didn't care because he wanted to promote himself, not the alt-right. His goal was promoting himself as the leader of the alt-right. But that's a little bit more speculative, but I think that's what happened, and all the pieces seem to fit on that. But okay, so they have their retard rallies, and they keep getting the best possible outcome from the retard rallies before Charlottesville, which is that they were ignored. They weren't getting coverage. That was the best outcome, that they were being ignored and no damage was done by them. But they kept rolling the dice, doing more and more retard rallies, and they finally came up snake eyes in one of them, and that was Charlottesville. And now they have all these institutions coming down trying to destroy them, and of course then it's expanded into Alex Jones and Gavin McInnes's groups. And I have no sympathy for the people who went to Charlottesville. They had plenty of warning, and you can say, oh, but we have a right to do this. It's not fair. Okay, well, the world's not fair, and you have to deal in the real world, not the ideal world of consistent law and social norms. You know what else isn't fair? That a lot of this crackdown on social media was caused by Charlottesville. Okay, so there's a very good chance that Gavin McInnes would not have been deplatformed if not for Charlottesville, which was something that he was telling you guys to not do. How's that for unfairness? Okay, so they got doxxed, smeared, and sued. If you were to aggregate the cost of these retard rallies in the logistics, in the lost jobs, and in the lawsuits, it's at least $1 million and one suicide. And that is blood on Richard Spencer's hands right there. All just completely burned, an incredible price paid for an absolute disaster. What else is great is we have these figures getting sued and getting money for getting sued. Now, you have to use judgment on this. You don't want to just abandon anyone who gets attacked, but at the same time, you don't want to subsidize behavior that gets people sued. Andrew Anglin, for example, got $100,000 for a completely avoidable lawsuit. That was a clear instance where there was an online targeted harassment campaign for somebody in Montana. And obviously, look, I don't think Andrew Anglin should have been sued, but at the same time, that kind of behavior is the kind of behavior that generates lawsuits. And it was a completely avoidable thing, and it should not be subsidized. Richard Spencer presumably got $25,000 for a completely avoidable lawsuit surrounding Charlottesville. Frankly, I don't think anybody who got in legal trouble surrounding Charlottesville should have gotten a dime. They chose to go there, and their idiocy should not be subsidized. That aside, Charlottesville is over. The silver lining of Charlottesville, I thought at the time, will be that Richard Spencer finally learned his lesson to not do retard rallies. Obviously, he's not going to try to do any more retard rallies after Charlottesville. Surely, by now, what all the opponents, people like me, had been saying was proven with flying colors at Charlottesville to not do these things, right? Well, not for Richard Spencer. He had retard rallies in Washington, D.C., Michigan State, and the University of Florida, all after Charlottesville. So when did Richard Spencer stop? What did it take for Richard Spencer to stop? It took three things. First, people stopped showing up. He wasn't getting any audience. Second, Traditional Workers' Party imploded. Up to this point, Matt Heimbach's Traditional Workers' Party had been the only militia outfit that would provide security at Richard's events. But then, in a story that ascended to levels of white trash that shouldn't even be possible, TWP imploded. And you can look into the specifics on that if you want to know what exactly happened there. And Richard Spencer, as a result of this, had no security as a result of TWP imploding because of Matthew Heimbach's, being all in the family. Third, Richard Spencer was running out of money, as evidenced by his begging online for $25,000 for his legal defense. So, what it took for Richard Spencer to stop doing retard rallies was to literally exhaust the physical ability to do so. Nobody was showing up to watch it, the security went away, and the money went away. That's what it took. Imagine a general who keeps ordering frontal attacks against an enemy's strongest point into an obvious kill zone, and he keeps doing it over and over and over and over and over and over again. That's no exaggeration. I believe Richard Spencer has done 6 retard rallies, 3 post-Charlottesville, and 2 were done before Charlottesville. One was Texas A&M, and I believe there's another one. But if it was just 5, then it was just 5. But however many it was at least over and over and over and over and over again. At least that. That's what Richard Spencer did. He was like a general who attacked the enemy's strongest point in an obvious kill zone 5 times in a row. He didn't become aware of the broader strategic situation or cognizant of the damage he was doing until the effects were literally 5 feet in front of his face. And what I think happened is he was stupid enough to listen to the news media when they said, right after Charlottesville, that the alt-right was destroyed because it wasn't having retard rallies anymore. That Shelbyville and Pikeville, which to his credit Richard Spencer did not go to, that those rallies were smaller than Charlottesville and thus signaled a decline in the alt-right. And sadly, I have to say that the Right Stuff podcast kept buying into this garbage, that we have to have a real world presence. We have to keep doing this. We can't just be on the internet, and we have to show them that we're still a strong force by asserting ourselves out in public. How stupid can you be to do that? Yeah, the institutional press, who hates you and wants you dead, wants you to keep doing retard rallies, and so they will say that your lack of retard rallies is a sign of defeat in order to keep you to get doing them. This is so simple. They're defining defeat as you not doing something that they want you to do. They want you to march out in public and look like idiots, right? That's what they want you to do. Okay, and you will look like idiots, right? Even if 95% of the guys, if 95 guys out of 100 are, well-dressed, well-spoken, completely like normal dudes, you only need 5 spurgs. And they'll focus on the 5 spurgs. That's going to become the story, and you'll look like idiots. Even you will. They'll make it so. And when describing Richard Spencer's inability to learn about this, to learn this stuff, remember, retard rallies are so obviously stupid that you should know to not do them, period. You shouldn't have to learn. This isn't something that needs to be learned. You just know, don't do this. This is really dangerous and out of control. If you have the vaguest idea of what CNN is and what the New York Times is, you just know to not do retard rallies. Now, as a result of Charlottesville, people considered alt-right or even associated with the alt-right started getting their channels taken down, websites got taken down, and that, which was something unprecedented, but that precedent was broken, largely thanks to Charlottesville, but also the antics of Andrew Anglin, which is another story. Andrew Anglin broke new ground in getting websites taken down from their web hosts, and payment processors started getting taken down, which was also unprecedented. So yes, Charlottesville broke a lot of new ground in that regard. And to his credit, at least Richard Spencer appears to be aware of this, but
Charlottesville bifurcated the alt-right's history. Every event became either before or after Charlottesville. Before, the alt-right was a fun subculture. We could have conferences and public events with little interference. After Seville, the system recognized us as a threat and the crackdown began. Many people lost their nerve. Things had become serious. Richard, where are we now?
I think you laid out the groundwork quite well. There is a BC and AC distinction in the alt-right. You could say a little bit of the same thing for Hailgate. I can remember this, the salad days of the Trump campaign in spring and summer of 2016 when we were getting along really well with all these alt-right figures. No one was counter-signaling anyone. We all felt like we were on the same team, and that was a great feeling. We obviously Hailgate shook some people out.
yeah, it just happened, guys. It's just a thing that happened. It's not a result of Richard Spencer having the institutional media large squarely up his ass at every event he tries to do. No. It just happened, and it shook some people out.
There was obviously a lot of counter signaling. There was a lot of senses. There were a lot of people saying things that were simply not true, like, "Oh, I didn't know what this was about. I thought this was just fun and pro-Trump." But Hailgate also served a very important purpose in defining the movement.
Yes, in defining the movement as neo-Nazi and thus as a failure.
This was a serious movement.
Yes, and through the antics of you and Chris Cantwell and Andrew Anglin, it is no longer a serious movement.
It is about victory. It is about identitarianism. It is about race. It is about touching the untouchable subjects.
And it's about winning.
And it is about winning. Hail victory.
Yeah, events up to this point have clearly shown that it is not about victory, and maybe you could spend less time hailing victory and more time getting out of the way of people who could possibly achieve some victory.
The one thing that I actually do hate is counter-signaling the concept of hail victory.
That doesn't mean anything.
But, there were a lot of bad things about Charlottesville. It was a disaster in that sense. At the same time, I don't regret in the slightest bit going, and I actually would have really painfully, personally regretted it if I didn't go.
Oh yeah,
Because
I would have never forgiven myself for not going.
Like you would have like canceled your marriage, or not that you're going to get married to to a woman at least. No, just kidding. No, but
Ouch.
but no, you would have canceled your marriage or your dog's funeral in order to be at Charlottesville. I mean, I get that.
Oh yeah,
but
that's goes without saying.
And so there's no question that we had to be there. And there's also no question that there are aspects of it that were deeply moralizing. It was bad. A moral victory is basically something where you take losses, you might even lose, but you understand yourself more, you feel like you learn something, you gain something. So there were aspects of it that were deeply moralizing. The image of the Torchlight March, the fact that this was no longer the meme war, this was in real life. You had, how many, 1,000 people, hundreds of people marching with torches. I mean, we came onto the scene.
It was, I think of it as bulking and cutting. Up until Charlottesville, we were bulking. We were packing on the pounds, hitting the gym every day. Our movement was growing. And then after Charlottesville, it's been getting rid of all the excess fat and getting nice and lean and hungry again.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and look, a lot of people left. A lot of people have cucked out. I think a lot of people have overlearned certain lessons from Charlottesville.
Earlier, I asked you, what would you compare this to? What would you compare this movement to? And the answer, the correct answer, is seduction.
Yeah.
We are conducting a mass seduction of society, and society is not going to want to sleep with us. And also, okay, we maybe, buy you some Skittles sometimes.
Is that how you seduce women?
Yes.
Skittles.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's why you get so many girls, I guess.
Yeah, it is.
You're throwing out
Yeah,
the Jolly Ranchers, maybe. I don't know what.
Well, okay, whatever.
But,
point is, you have the hardcore, like you show that you are the
yes. And we're going to take losses. That's the other thing. It's like, ride it out. So,
basically calm the fuck down.
Yes. And
which is something I've said many times in these, when we have activism events and people are freaking out over some minor issue.
Right.
It's game day. Calm the fuck down. Play your position.
Play your position. Hey, Conti, what position did you play by following the Charlottesville charlatan? Was it cuck? Did you lose your job to play the cuck position on Richard's team? How long till that comes out? Richard describes this as a new phase, a new era we're going through. So this guy just sank the USS Alt-Right. Everyone's paddling out on lifeboats, and he's here saying, guys, I know this is hard, but we're entering a new phase of the voyage, and only the strongest among us will be able to continue. No, this is not a new phase in some planned progression. This was a completely avoidable disaster. And no, you're not bulking and then cutting the fat. Okay, it's not the fat that's being cut. It's the people with jobs that are being cut. It's the normal people that are being cut. It's your best people that are cutting themselves away from you. Right, all the shitty people, all the white nationalist 1.0 types, all the Aryan nations types, those people are the ones that remain. that hardcore that will always be there, that's what remains. That's not the best stuff. It's not like the worst stuff is being cut and the best stuff remains. No, the best stuff gets cut, and the spurgy remnant is what remains. Now, at this point, Richard Spencer can't hold down a website, can't go to a gym, gets harassed out in public. He has a Twitter, okay, which is something that Sargon of Akkad, Destiny, and I cannot say, and quite a few, like, very milquetoast people can't say that they have a Twitter. But Richard Spencer, for whatever reason, is able to keep his Twitter despite sort of milquetoast conservatives losing theirs. His YouTube channel has been destroyed, and he's been banned from PayPal and Stripe. In this context, okay, and now I'm not supporting all that, but that's largely was a result of Charlottesville. But in this context of him being unable to do much at all, Richard Spencer says he's against Brexit because he likes the idea of taking over the European Union and having it as a white imperium. He says he's against the idea of a small white country, calling it mockingly Hobbit states. Right? He's against a small white country like Hungary or Poland, but once an empire.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Nick just said. My vision of an ethno-state is not a ethno-state in the sense that Poland right now is an ethno-state for the time being, I'd say, or Hungary is an ethno-state. It is a grander concept. It is an imperial concept. I'm so not an ethno-nationalist. I even acknowledge the fact that there is a certain white man's burden to us. We are a ruling imperial people. We are going to probably, for better and for worse, going to have to take care of a lot of non-white people into eternity. And that is not something that I am excited about, but the idea that we can just live and let live. I'm a nationalist for all nations, or all this kind of just goofy liberalism. It's basically these kind of people who say that I'm a nationalist for all nations, live and let live. That is effectively liberalism on a global scale, on a national scale. I am not a nationalist for all nations. I do not want all nations to pursue their dreams. I also recognize geopolitics and the nature of power.
So does everyone else. Look, Richard, this isn't some unique insight. Everyone knows about countries influencing other countries. We all know that things like China and the United States and the European Union and a kind of global deep state exists. And yet small countries like Poland and Hungary and Estonia and Finland can exist with a degree of sovereignty. Nick Fuentes might find this neat and imagine that you know that there exists global power and influence, but dum-dums like Ramsey Paul and Ryan Faulk don't know this. But yes, we all know about global power dynamics, and yet there Hungary and Poland are, and they're not taking in migrants. They're able to flex their sovereignty in many situations. I get it, Richard. You want to be king of the castle. You want to be king of the planet. Cool. I don't. And realistically, you're not going to be able to.
History is often a zero-sum game. History is often about subordination and domination. And it's about patronage and so on. And if we want to try to get away from that in order to be ideologically pure, like, oh, every ethnicity will have its little state, we're not going to really go anywhere. So again, I think that America is effectively done. I do not think that we can return to anything. And so the burden is on us. It's a terrible burden. It's not a fun one. We're going to rub people the wrong way. It's going to seem impractical, but we're going to have to think these radical thoughts going forward to truly imagine a new future.
Yes, and maybe one day this conqueror will be able to conquer his way to having access to any kind of media platform. But he does this, and then he says he's also against free speech.
I would put our lot with the government as opposed to Silicon Valley. And, as many of these senators pointed out, Facebook has, the equivalent of China is using their service on a daily basis. And
but as far as government regulation, I mean, yes, I think in the short term we would favor government regulation of speech, but long term, are we even pro free speech?
No, of course not. But we have to use this platform in order.
So we're being radically honest here.
Yes, radically pragmatic. Yes.
Oh, thanks, Richards. Now, first off, Like, on this, you really, really should be in favor of free speech. It's like being in favor of evolution or the ability to mutate, because to change law, you have to change minds. And to change minds, you have to have robust free speech that is well protected enough not to be squashed by powerful institutions. Because the whole point of free speech is to destroy powerful institutions, right? The point of free speech is to conduct a massive revision of existing institutions and foundational beliefs. The point of free speech is to rip the heart out of an existing power structure. That's one of the things that made the West better than the rest, was the ability to constantly transform itself. I know that's kind of like a shit-lib talking point, but it's one of the true ones. Okay, it's one of the true shit-lib talking points, that the ability to radically transform itself over and over again is what made the West better than the rest. Like this, and this is so basic. Like, I'm having to argue basic, like, why you should be in favor of free speech to Richard Spencer. Like, this is ridiculous. So, and the thing is, I'm being associated with this clown, and I'm being attacked, and a lot of the justifications of the attacks on me are stuff that Richard Spencer has done, and here I am trying to explain him basic things, like, yeah, here's why, like, being in favor of free speech is really fucking important. And it is important for a civilization to continue to adapt to changes in technology. Like, so, and our enemies, every step of the way, they got to where they are by taking over media and the courts and politicians and enacting law and giving one-sided accounts of the world in universities, in the school system, and in mass media. But forget that. I don't think I need to hard convince the YouTube audience that the free speeches are good. Let's just say that for the sake of argument that you are, in fact, against free speech. Let's just say that. Okay. From a purely strategic standpoint, how stupid can you be to openly say that, especially given Richard Spencer's situation where he is highly reliant on ostensibly neutral media platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, like totally dependent on that. He's totally dependent on their good graces, and yet he's there shitting on them, saying, yeah, if I was in charge, you know, all these people that disagree with me would be censored. So here's the situation. Wikipedia describes the National Policy Institute as a white supremacist organization. And in the past, I would just say, no, they're not a white supremacist organization. I try to defend it. But you can't do that now, because people can just bring up recent clips of Richard Spencer going on about white imperium and being against hobbit states, wanting to take over the EU and you know, wanting to enslave Haitians. And so if you're going to bring up how he has a right to free speech, though, well, he can just bring up, somebody who's arguing against you will just bring up how Richard Spencer is opposed to free speech. So they can just call him a white supremacist and ban him, and his supporters have no real moral grounds to complain, because he is in fact a white supremacist and he's against free speech. Like, Now, let's look at his Twitter. Let's look at his pinned tweet he has up here. When I last looked at his Twitter, he says, "Let there be no mistake. A black James Bond would be an act of dispossession far greater than a flotilla of 1 million refugees." Nope, that's just a weird, random, wrong statement from Richard Spencer. Obviously, 1 million refugees would be way worse than a black James Bond, and also, whose masculinity is defined by Hollywood? He also made a video against the RAISE Act, saying that Asians would be worse than blacks and Hispanics, which is, again, nope, just another one of these just random, wrong statements he likes to make. As I showed earlier in this video, Asians are way better than those two groups in just about every way, every quantifiable way from our point of view. And he just has all of these esoteric, bad takes. He's like a guy who goes to some obscure corners of the earth to dig up turds and tell you that they're exotic truffles. No, they're just really hard to find turds. Hey, Brexit is a bad idea, so are countries. We should use all of this power that we have to take over the EU. Or, you know, if you talk to some shitlib or some boomer conservative, you know what they're going to say. It's dumb, but you know sort of the historical context in which their beliefs come from. Their beliefs aren't entirely logical, they're a function of their history. You know, it came from the boomer conservative turd factory, or the on the Democrats are the real racists line, which is right next to Hitler was a socialist, right? Stuff like that. And you kind of know where it comes from. There's kind of a whole milieu and a historical context to those kinds of statements. In contrast, Richard Spencer has these boutique turds. Let me tell you why the U.S. should have enslaved Haitians after the hurricane. Phalanx. Gotta talk about Phalanx. Phalanx was an organization that Richard Spencer was charging people $1,000 to be in. And the idea is they were going to have little secret meetups and have some sort of secret society. Of course, this was leaked. And after it was leaked, Richard Spencer sent out a memo saying, quote, "I take personal responsibility for the leak, and I apologize to members." Now, this is something I really don't like, is when people say, "I take personal responsibility." This isn't just Richard Spencer, but people generally say, "I take personal responsibility." What's that supposed to mean? You take personal responsibility? How about you take financial responsibility for all those people who trusted you and followed you into Charlottesville? And he says, "It is clear that my operation was not as tight as it could and should have been. I assure you that I have recognized my failure and am currently working to right our course." Oh, don't worry, guys. He's working on it. He's going to have a conference with several New York Times reporters about this. And also, it's funny he says this, but this second memo talking about the leak also got leaked. So he's working on it, and then this thing itself gets leaked. Continues. Here are some takeaways. One summer event will take place as planned on August 19th to 21st. However, it will change locations, but remain within driving distance of Washington, D.C., so no one's travel plans should be affected. I was on the wrong track in terms of fundraising on December of 2015, which resulted in the webpage that got leaked and some higher prices of Phalanx membership. Our membership fees will remain at $50 and $100. Other people who are able to give $1,000 will be part of a separate society. Phalanx must remain secret. Thus, over the summer, we should seriously consider dropping our current name and logo as well as adopting other changes. A Phalanx member was able to locate the young man, the leaker, and I requested he call me. When we talked, he apologized for exposing the group. I accepted his sincere gesture and scolded him for posting what was clearly private and secret. Ironically, he asked if he could become a member of Phalanx. In his words, "This secret organization sounds amazing. I'm going to think about this." He is clearly very immature. So the guy who exposed the secret society wanted to be part of the secret society, and Richard Spencer says he'll think about it. Yeah. Like, what? What? like I mean, I feel like I should have some commentary on this, but like, there it is. Like, this guy who exposed the secret society now wants to join the secret society, and Richard Spencer goes, "I'm going to think about this." I had a talk with him, and he seemed very genuine in how sad he was about exposing it. Like, that's how played can you get? Anyway, continuing. What's with the $1,000 pricing level? This December, I pursued a fundraising strategy that I regret and have ceased. My motives were good. His motives were good, by the way. My motives were good, but I have recognized that I was on the wrong track. Yes, charging people $1,000 to be part of a meetup club was a good idea in principle, but it was just the wrong track. Good motives, but wrong. Continues. Many consultants have suggested that I offer more access to donors and potential donors and make them feel part of the team. One suggestion was that we create a society and an online forum, etc. That's right, kids, an online forum. But one where you can only talk to people who gave Richard Spencer money. Doesn't that sound grand? And these meetups, these aren't like the riffraff you get at the TRS pool parties. No, these are meetups where you get to hobnob with people who gave Richard Spencer money. But I'm glad Richard Spencer has consultants. I mean, if this is what he puts out with consultants, and obviously with the retard rallies, what he says with, like, yeah, we're against free speech. Like, when he says all this stuff, this is what he says with consultants. Imagine what he'd be without whatever consultants he has. He continues. My sense was that I can barely keep up with a Phalanx forum and events. So why not combine the societies and create different levels within Phalanx? The people I showed this webpage to were those who have donated more than $500 in the past, or whom had been vetted through phalanx procedures. Oh, good. They got procedures. They got phalanx procedures. So I guess this letter that we're seeing here that was leaked on NPC, on My Posting Career, was put on a webpage that was only available to people who gave Richard at least $500. So, okay, that's kind of funny. What is the new plan? 1. Phalanx will stay Phalanx. We might need a new name and logo, but we should not drastically change this good thing we have going. It's a good thing they have going. Phalanx membership will be $50 per year for young people and $100 per year for more established members. A. It is important for Phalanx to remain eminently affordable, but it is also important for all members to invest something in our group. B. Phalanx gatherings are generally cash flow negative. In other words, every event has lost money. And this does not account for the time spent planning events. Oh, fuck you, the time spent. But we are able to hold events only because some of our older members step up and purchase patron registrations. Before we offered these, NPI would subsidize Phalanx gatherings out of our general funds. Finally! Finally, we now know what NPI actually did all this time. They funded Richard Spencer's secret Boy Scout retreats. So, okay, there we go. Because it was always a mystery because NPI would get money. They had this dumb little website that never posted anything new. But they were getting something like $100,000 a year. And it's like, what were they doing with this? Where was this money going? What does NPI actually do? Like a lot of people were asking. And now we know they were funding, Boy Scout retreats. White supremacist Boy Scout retreats. And I can actually say that sentences, that's not a slander, that's not a mischaracterization, that's what these are. Continues. 3. Our new society for donors will be called the Sam Francis Circle. It will have some similarities with Phalanx, like social gatherings, but it will not be Phalanx. Some Phalanx members will become San Francisco Circle members. Some San Francisco Circle members will be asked to join Phalanx, but the two will never be equated. There will be times when I will try to create events that bring together Phalanx and San Francisco Circle members. This will be done thoughtfully and after Phalanx members have been informed. I feel like I should say I feel like this needs more commentary, but what is there to say? This right here, this is peak Spencer, the Sam Francis Circle, and fine clothes and fine wine and conferences and retreats and Julius Evola, culminating in winning lines like, I'm against free speech, and we should enslave Haitians. And of course, he tried the same thing with altright.com. For $100 a year, you get access to premium content. For $500 or even $2,500 a year, you may get to go on a field trip with Richard Spencer himself. What a privilege. Think of all the hard liquor and cocaine Richard could buy with all that money. Now, I should address the myth that Richard Spencer created the alt-right here, when in reality, Richard Spencer got to where he was through connections and being lucky. So, his first sort of big gig in politics was to become assistant editor at the American Conservative, from which he was fired from 9 months later for being too extreme. This was from March to December of 2007. He then had a 23-month stint as executive editor at Tacky's Mag from January 2008 to December 2009, after which he was let go due to the publication's stagnation. From March 2010 to July 2012, he founded and edited the Alternative Right original website. The term Alternative Right, he got that from Paul Gottfried. Spencer started Radix Journal sometime in 2011 while he was still at thealternativeright.com, but in July 2012, he shut down thealternativeright.com to focus exclusively on Radix. But by 2013, this alternative right thing started to be memed as a catch-all term for conservatives, reactionaries, and to a lesser extent, white nationalists who were dissatisfied with the Republican Party and with establishment conservative outlets like National Review and Glenn Beck. Now, this is where the timeline gets a bit fuzzy and somewhat subjective, because after jettisoning the alt-right label and website, sometime in the middle of 2013, Richard Spencer tried to get the label back and position himself as the head man of the alt-right, though not necessarily some formal leader. And this is a strange situation here, because back in 2013, 2014, 2015, we all knew, quote unquote, that what Richard Spencer had done. We all knew that he was trying to position himself as Mr. Alt-Right. We all, quote unquote, knew this. But I can't point you to any specific thing that shows that this is what he was trying to do. One thing would be his willingness to talk to establishment media, which of course smeared him and gave him exposure, so he became the central figure of the alt-right. And of course, the natural reaction at the time was to defend Richard Spencer against media smears. But see, that's a natural reaction. The default reaction for people who support some kind of dissident right viewpoint. And so their instinct for a lot of people was to defend Richard Spencer. And at first, that's what they did, and that's what I did at first. I did. I defended Richard Spencer at the beginning. But Richard Spencer kept exploiting this. He kept interacting with the media. He kept getting smeared. And the site The Right Stuff, which was probably the most influential site within the alt-right, more so than the Daily Stormer. The Daily Stormer might have gotten more traffic, might have. I'm a little bit skeptical about their numbers, but I don't want to go into that straight away. The Right Stuff, they made a huge mistake of constantly calling to defend Richard and to never, quote-unquote, punch right. Now, that's a fine line you have to walk here, because on the one hand, you can't just abandon anyone who gets smeared by the media or makes a few mistakes. Because if you're too cutthroat, then you won't have anyone left in your movement. But on the other hand, you can't burn down the whole movement trying to save one guy who keeps fucking up. And the Right Stuff, they prevented for a time. Now they've stopped now. Mike Enoch appears to have gotten religion on this. They prevented for a time the healthy and necessary rejection of bad apples. And Richard Spencer not only exploited the natural tendency of people who broadly agree with him to defend him when he got attacked by the media, but this tendency was propped up by a norm pushed through the alt-right of don't punch right. That's the problem. It's hard enough to deal with lies told about us as is. It becomes even more difficult when they have this avatar they can point to where all the lies end up actually being true, right? A privileged white male who cynically uses free speech but opposes free speech and is a white supremacist. Like that's that's literally Richard Spencer right there. You know, Richard Spencer comes forward and says, yes, I am a white supremacist. We're the best. We deserve white privilege, which totally exists because we're the best. Oh, and I'm against free speech. Oh, and I'm a trust fund baby, and I'm damn proud of it because I deserve it. So when they ban me, they can just point to Richard. And there's a whole bunch of shit stains who will go, well, the alt-right opposes free speech, and Ryan Faulk is part of the alt-right, so he deserves to be banned. You know, of course, I mean, the alt-right just grew around me. Me and also this guy, Sean Last, we were doing what we were doing long before any alt-right ever existed. So, like to say we're part of it, well, no, we predate it. But anyway.
He's invited me to his apartment in the most expensive part of Alexandria, Virginia. He's hanging out with his followers.
I don't think I've ever done a video where I'm not wearing a collared shirt. Yeah. But in terms of formal wear, I like things that are striking, high quality, well made. No.
And then he saw me wear it.
Yeah. I was like, oh, it's dead.
Oh, the proles.
Get out.
The proles are doing it now.
Yeah. Get out quick. Got some wild turkey. Let's get an actual whiskey glass you idiot. Oh. Okay, fine.
I'm not going to teach you one small ideology, one very narrow one, two that's put underneath the alt-right.
As a natural leader, I have certain obligations and duties that other people don't.
Why are you someone who should lead?
I think that's obvious. Why do I need to even talk about it?
Say it. Tell me
Because
why.
I'm better. Yeah, I'm going to tell you something.
Go on.
All right. Elites rule the world. Elites make history. The question is who is in charge? That's what matters. People like me need to be in charge. We determine the course of world history in ways that other races can't even dream of doing.
And part of your greatness is the exploitation of other people. Part of what's made this country great.
We did it. We took it. We took it with force. We won. We took the entire continent. That's what matters.
You want to know something funny about this video is that everyone in this video here that was in Richard Spencer's little clique, they have now since disassociated from Richard Spencer. Greg Conte, seen here completely smashed while Spencer's talking about how superior he is, was the last person to hang on with Richard Spencer, and he was the most recent, and it's basically been confirmed at this point that Richard Spencer slept with Conte's girlfriend. Jason Giorgiani, Evan McLaren, Nathan D'Amigo, Charles Lyons, and now Greg Conte have left his little dumpster fire, and now Richard's most important outside allies, Mike Enoch and Sven of the Right Stuff, are themselves going to be putting some distance between themselves and Richard. But here, he's agreeing with the interviewer with the bullshit that white America ever profited from dealing with blacks or Native Americans. And this is amazing. Like, all the work I did showing that whites in the South were made much poorer by slavery, and that all the Native Americans did was fight against the white man, and today mainly live off of money from the government or from taking money from vulnerable white people with their casino monopolies. Right? All this work I do showing, no, white privilege is a myth, and exploitation is most certainly a myth. I talk about colonialism, that the colonial empires didn't profit. These empires ended up not being profitable. That's one of the reasons they let them all go, because they weren't getting any money out of it. All these lies about history that people like me are fighting against, they just get flushed down the toilet by these stupid statements by Richard Spencer, who himself has positioned himself as Mr. Alt-Right, and here he is agreeing with the central tenets of the anti-white racial oppression narrative. And this guy's supposed to be on my side, and here he is promoting these fucking lies. These fucking lies that the basic data that we have today completely dunks on.
There we go.
Outside his apartment, protesters have gathered to hold a vigil for Heather Heyer, the woman who was killed at Charlottesville.
Good to see you. You guys just stare at me in a dead, kind of eyed way. God, these people are pathetic. Do you know how, dumb this is? You think you people intimidate me.
We shall overcome.
Oh my God.
We shall overcome.
Shouldn't live that long.
Seriously, you guys are jerks.
I gotta give Richard some credit here. This is pretty funny. I don't think Richard's trying to be funny here. I think Richard really is just this much of an asshole. But this, give the devil his due. Give Richard some credit here. This is actually pretty funny. Is calling these people in the vigil pathetic. Now, people can point that this was deceptively edited on this was like a Norwegian public broadcast thing here. And it probably was. Maybe Richard was saying to drink from a whiskey glass because Conte was drinking too much, as evidenced by the fact that he was later smashed. Or maybe Richard spent a long time explaining his strategy was better than that of the establishment conservatives, and then he just sort of simplified that to, I'm just better, when asked to explain his old strategy again. Or this video of him just standing there with a weird smile, this looks like he was waiting for a picture to be taken. Maybe that's what he was doing. Or when he calls the vigil protesters pathetic, he could mean that it's pathetic how they won't respond to him, not that it's pathetic that they're having a vigil, right? I mean, there's all sorts of, it's so easy to edit things in such a way to make anybody look demonic. So sure, let's say that this is all true. Let's say that this was massively deceptively edited. And let's say that all the stuff was massively deceptively edited, which no doubt it was to one degree or another. But why are they there? Why is the media there? Why did Richard constantly thrust us, or what once was us, not anymore, why did he thrust us into these media battles? These media battles that we couldn't possibly win. But I'm talking in circles. I could go on for another fucking hour of just how shitty Richard Spencer is. Now, one thing at this point that we should all be careful of is Richard trying to dissociate himself from the alt-right. Do not let him do this. He is the alt-right. The alt-right is him. He seized that label as it was getting popular, even after he had abandoned it because he didn't see it going anywhere. He went with radix, Okay, but then as alt-right became popular, they say, "Oh, that's me, that's me, that's me." And then once he became Mr. Alt-right, he drove it straight into the fucking ground, burning everyone around him who had also latched onto the label. Remember, back in 2012, he jumped the alt-right ship when he thought it wasn't going anywhere. So there's perfectly good reason to think that he'll try to jump ship now that alt-right has become a toxic brand. Get ready for him to say shit like, "You know, the alt-right was just a brand. It was just a vessel that has served its purpose. Now it's time to move on to something bigger and grander. Don't let him do this. We need to bury him along with the alt-right."
And it just is that. There's nothing more to be said.
Well, I'm back, and I don't plan on making any more videos like this. This isn't a video I was excited to make, but was something I just had to do. I've been putting off making this video for months. I have no idea what the reaction to this video is going to be. This could be my first net negative video since 2007, 2008. But coming up, I'll be getting back to the issues. There's lots of stuff going on. I'm really excited to be back. I'm not using PayPal anymore, so if you're interested in supporting someone who may or may not be me, you can send money via Zelle to the email address nimruzi@gmail.com. You can also send money to someone who has a Patreon and posts images called Cool Tapes, and payments are made for each image. Now, this Patreon account may or may not just so happen to post a picture every time I happen to post a high effort video on my YouTube channel. I cannot confirm or deny that, and I scoff at any charge that this is simply a way for people to pay me for videos without having to technically tie my videos to the actual payment processor. I'm shocked and appalled at such charges. Now, there's a bunch of stuff I want to talk about going forward on this channel. You know, the effects of communism compared to types of mass immigration on a country, the genocide myth regarding the Belgian Congo, more stuff, something that I've been reading into regarding something that True Dilton brought up, biological Leninism, Russian influence versus Jewish influence, and anti-white racism in the US military.